Well, greetings and welcome to the fourth in the series of this century thinking webinars. This one still pulls at the thread of value and how indeed we can imagine it different. And because I'm always reminded of Einstein, just saying how it was that before he could actually do the mathematics or develop the concepts of his theories of relativity, he couldn't do that until he could imagine himself riding a light beam, So it's really about the cognitive perspectives that we carry as to whether or not first we're able to, before we get the difference that we seek, imagine it different. And that's what I'd like to kick that ball into court today, and let's have a little play with it. But first, I was reminding myself following my dear father's death of a time when he just got himself a brand new Holden Monaro, which for those of us in Australia, we'd know as a bit of a sports version of the family car that when really souped up could actually get into production racing. So it was Dad's, I'm 40 and I'm going, but when I was 19, he let me drive that. And my girlfriend was sitting alongside me, now my wife, and I was 19, she was 17. Dad was in the back with my two brothers, and we're going down towards a beachside settlement south of Adelaide. And you come up over this hill and long dip in front of you, and away off into the hill was a long straight road. Now in 1973, 4 this would have been, you could just floor it. So I just floored it. And away we went, boom, the old speedo was ramping up 95, 100 miles an hour. And I still kept pressing it, warm. And there was nothing said until this little voice in the back said, "What are you trying to prove, son?" And that has stuck with me ever since. It could have gone off his bloody head. I might well have done if it was my kids doing what's the equivalent now of about 170, 180 kilometers an hour on not quite an open road. But he didn't. He asked the question, "What are you trying to prove, son?" And I think about that now in the context of the economy. We're all at COVID lockdown, looking for COVID normal, but really, politicians and everyone else is saying, but it's the economy, stupid, and there's an economic crisis. Well, is there? And I really am aiming to see how we might imagine that different, because as we're trying to flip the levers on the economy and get that back to what economists love is the growth and more growth, forgetting, of course, just like the numbers on this dial, that there's limits to growth. And one might wonder where indeed is that parental voice saying to the economists of our world, "What are you trying to prove, son?" What are you trying to prove? And I'm not sure that we're actually trying to prove anything. It's just a behavior pattern that we've gotten into because we look at where we were last year and more is better. And that's something I'd like to imagine different. But so I'm not so much about trying to prove something, but come back to that statement that we've pushed through this is, look, let's before getting to an outcome, let's not rush past value. And so what we've looked at, what we're looking at today is this notion then of where do we contribute value? And just as a bit of a recap, of course, last time we looked at how we conceived of value, and value in the sense that drives behavior, and starting with honesty, because if you haven't got the truth, what else have you? Transparency, and let's deal with the whole truth, please. And let's be mindful also that we individuals are a system in a family, in a community, working in a business, and in a national enterprise that's part of the planet. So let's be mindful of the whole. And when we're mindful of the whole, then we've got a better basis for dealing with the collaboration that we engage in, because none of us can do all of this ourselves. Now, given where we make commitments in collaboration, accountability then comes into play to say, did you do what you said you'd do? It's not about blame, but it is about living up to doing what you said you'd do. And then from that, recognizing that we're working with honesty and transparency, and things are complex and chaotic, things will go wrong. And are we going to, in all honesty, take the truth forward? Because one of the dangers is, of course, that we'll get pilloried and the messenger will get shot. So it's absolutely critical that we finish off these values with the value of respect, and how we live them in ourselves, and then how we take them to our organizations and globally is really where I now want to explore how we go from the inside out, in terms of taking what we might hold to be true as a good set of behaviors into the world. But as we know, it's a bloody mess, and there's a lot on this slide, and there's a hell of a lot more that's even not on this slide that should be. And that mess has largely been driven from an economic point of view. Show me the money. We've just had a budget here in Australia, right? And it's all about inputs, how much money we can put in to actually helping to change and improve the situation. But within that economy view, there's people that really are missing out. And we'll explore that a little bit more in a moment. But the social dimension is wrapped in an economic blanket that causes harm right now. And then even within that, we humans have got to a stage where we are driving nature, not nature driving us. And as we explored in the first of these webinars, you know, we've since 1970 killed 60% of the wildlife population, and we've done that much habitat damage that we're threatening 85% of the existing species. And that's to say nothing of climate change and the things that we're doing with fossil fuels and all sorts of pollutants that are breaking the crust on this atmosphere that holds life. So it's a bit of a raw deal by and large as we look at the mess that we're currently in. We see ethics missing in the chase for finances, foreclosures from property markets, banks, you know, who manage trillions of dollars, but yet, you know, provide very little value for the salaries that are paid. We see in Canada, self-interest driving. So this is the Alberta tar sands, and And Alberta is the richest of the 12 provinces in Canada. But at what cost, right? At what cost when we see this sort of decimation of what was otherwise a pristine environment, driven, of course, by the self-interest and the dollar driving things. And there's greed. I was amazed to see the growth in CEO salaries, you know, and actually being able to put some numbers on it. Since 1970, since 1978, so it's looking at the 40-year period up to 2018, the ratio of CEO salaries to the average worker's pay has increased phenomenally in different countries. At the top end, United States, 265 times a typical worker's salary is what the CEO will get paid. And down through the various nations, India, UK, Canada, Germany, China, 127 times the typical worker. So, they're as much a capitalist state as the United States. And that little number, Australia, 78. That's the number for Australia. So we're not immune to it. We're not standing back here in Australia going, no, look at you buggers in the rest of the world. No. It's an endemic problem around the world as CEO remuneration has come, so far, so fast at the expense of everyone else. And of course, that's driving inequalities. And at its source here, we can compare, this typical CEO growth, or the average CEO growth in salary since 1978, over 1,000%. Beats the stock market by 300%, 3 times. And that 1%, that is the very high earners, are doing exceptionally well, but, relative to the CEOs, only getting a third of the increase, because they're the 0.1% that then gives us eight men in this world owning as much as the bottom half of the population of the world. And the real growth in workers, typical workers' salary, has been 12%. Just extraordinary differences. And one wonders then where this whole inequality is coming from. And it's right there on the page. So as each of us then looks at those values that we conceive, and we take them through our partnerships with, the ones most dear to us, and we look out, we wonder, how is it that we've lost trust? And of course, we looked at that a little last week. But let's remember, as we remembered last week, that everything's connected, from the individual through to the global, right? The individual's connected, just as my dad learned and practiced when he was a maritime engineer on what is here the Edinburgh Castle, which is essentially everything a small town needs in one container, traveling the world. And so being completely aware of how everything's connected was absolutely crucial here. And perhaps one thing in this picture that they weren't so aware of was all of that black soot coming out the bloody chimney to damage the environment at the time. Now, and that's not strictly true. It was still being ignored. There are papers pointing all the way back to well over 100 years ago, saying how much that we were, even in those days, ignoring that part of the problem. But nonetheless, what we're really aiming for, what am I trying to prove, son? Well, I don't know about trying to prove, but I'm looking for the conversations that say, how do we as individuals in growing up with the values that we grow up, remain congruent and authentic as we engage through our community's business nationally and globally. So what if we imagine it different? What if we imagine, first and foremost, we took a planetary view? Now, we often hear that, you know, in business that we need to get our heads above the mire. We need to lift our sights, you know, and take a helicopter view of what's happening. Well, frankly, a helicopter view is not enough. I think that because of the way everything's connected these days, we've got to get back all the way back to the moon and look back at this big blue marble that's in the sky, that's in the solar system, and look from there. Because even a local beverage seller down at the cellar door there, he'll have soda water from Norway, he'll have gin from all parts of the world, rum from Jamaica. You know, his business depends on global connections, even just a small business such as that. And so it is. That's the nature of the interconnected world. But within that, let's look at how we work with the planet, as many First Nations people have done for tens of thousands of years. And then somewhere in there, there's got to be a little bit of money, the economy, because it is one way through which we can actually enact and have a currency that enables this global transaction, but it should be grease to the wheels, not the wheels itself. And of course, it's more than that. Our impact on the world, let's imagine that we can be mindful in all dimensions, from where our food comes, from the very special species that exist, you know, and if we think it's bad above, you know, on the land and in the air, should have a look at the destruction that's going on under the sea. You know, you wouldn't want to be a bloody turtle or an albatross. You know, you'd end up with a belly full of plastic. You know, forestries, bird life, wildlife, and indeed how we engage almost symphonically as well as symbiotically with this planet. Imagine that. So instead of being economy-led with a profit-centered design, imagine we're ecology-led with a life-centered design. And I need to give due recognition to Prashant Darwin here. Prashant set forward these ideas that I'm picking up on at his keynote address to the International Council of Systems Engineering in 2019, just last year. And he's the CEO of Biomimicry India. And this is part of his imagining that indeed we have a life-centered design, not human-centered design, because human-centered design has led to profit-centered design. But then I wonder, are we pushing it all uphill? You know, are we the Sisyphus of our days? What have we done to deserve this? No, that's the wrong question, Richard. It's not about that. It's about imagining that future and showing people what is possible. Well, I was shown that this last week. In my advert for the previous webinar, well, in fact, before I do that, I've jumped ahead. And and where, you know, the doubt arises is from this quote that comes from someone who had, a systems thinker who had made this quote to me in writing, you know, and he says that what bothers me, government aside, you know, is a growing discord between inconsequential do-gooder sloganeering and behavioral change. Well, is that what I'm about here? I'm questioning myself. Inconsequential do-gooder sloganeering? Oh, bloody hell, no, I sincerely hope not. This is about systems thinking and trying to get people to think and act and behave as if we were all part of one planetary system. So then I look back at my add to the previous webinar, which was about valuing governing values. And I'd made this statement that people don't practice good behaviors when posters are telling them one thing and leaders are doing another. Well, Mark Butler, who's a mate of mine, and he's also a clinical psychologist and works a lot in mental health people and working with organizations to build awareness in mental health. Absolutely crucial right now. Picked up on this and used it in his own white paper that he was pushing out to organizations. And then lo and behold, he shares this week, that he'd received this from someone who had read his white paper. At this point in time, I have resigned from my role and I am in between jobs. And there's my quote. People don't practice good behaviors when posters are telling them one thing and leaders are doing another. And this lady's telling Mark, this quote from your white paper is the reason I resigned. So I think what that tells us is that we have to keep going. People are listening and people are taking action. And it only takes one at a time for that trickle to become a draft, where people then are going within themselves and going, you know what, this isn't aligned with where I'm working, and I'm going with where I'm aligned. And if that's over here or over there, then that's where I'm headed, but I'm not staying here. And here was a wonderful example that we're not pushing it uphill and that you really don't know what's happening behind the scenes or what impact you're having. And of course, as I think back on that, that's exactly what Daniel Kahneman was saying, is that, you know, he as a Nobel laureate that shared with, and I should know the other fellow's name, and I apologize to him that I don't. But what Kahneman was about was challenging the assumption that, you know, human rationality prevails in modern economics. And he's saying, no, we are all, Tversky, Joe, had died, sadly, before the Nobel Prize had, you're right. Yes, so, and that's why he didn't get because the Nobel Prizes are not issued posthumously. And so these two had, you know, an enduring relationship, challenging from dramatically different points of view, but coming to this work of saying that actually what happens up here emotionally and the cognitive state here affects what we do and affects economics on a grand scale. So, you know, forget about rationality and the like. Then there's Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and he's the guy who in 2002 was just, you know, talking at a conference at which Daniel Kahneman was present, and that's where he first got to know him, but went on through with encouragement from Kahneman to actually write his book on black swan events, and his whole thesis around encouraging societies to be prepared to deal with black swan events, right? COVID, brilliant. And not only to be prepared, but actually to be what he calls anti-fragile. And it's not resilient and it's not robust. It's about how you're strengthened through the disruption that you're facing. Remarkable thinking. Anyway, there was a lovely Guardian article, and in conversation with a number of people, one of which was Taleb, and he was asked, what did he learn from Daniel Kahneman's work? And here was his answer, that the thing that most stood out to him from Kahneman was that people don't perceive standalone objects, rather differences from an anchor point. And what that did for Taleb was to go, so if I change the anchor point, we can force people to have a healthy outlook. And you go, wow, that's stunning. Well, I wonder if the same's true here. Here's our current anchor point with man-made laws from economics that we follow, and nature's and biological laws and axioms which we ignore. But what if we changed our anchor to Prashant Darwin's concepts for life-centered design? How bloody good would that be? So just to simplify the pictures, what if we anchored on value and look at how we contribute to the planet, to the people, and to the economy in that order? And it is just a simple inversion from the current order. Simply said. And the big issue that a lot of economists will say is, but, we need economic growth. But money and the economy is not the only currency. The biggest currency on a planetary scale is energy. And if we are in the current anchor of an economy-led society, then we are seeking growth and we are ripping the earth apart, burning it in order to generate that growth, which, as we've seen before, really impacts just a few that get immensely rich while the typical worker is just barely making progress. And what Geoffrey West, who's a physicist out of Los Alamos, did at Santa Fe Institute, where a physicist came into somewhere that was really taking a biological view, was write a wonderful book called Scale. Really worth the effort to read this. But one example within that, he talks about energy. And he says that if from an economic point of view, we were to burn and every possible resource and element that could be reduced and get our energy from the reduction of the earth, which is an enormous amount of energy. Know this, that the sun gives us that amount of energy twice every year. So if we're going to grow the economy, then we need to think about how we make the most of what the sun is giving us. Double the total energy resource on Earth every year. So we can grow the economy if we grow the social dimension, and if we, before that, grow the ecological dimensions. So taking an ecological view is really what I find all embracing. We can do that by anchoring on value, standing back, looking at every decision that we might make from the point of view of the moon and what's its consequences through the people and to the planet. And if I just get out of the way here, then there's this wonderful quote from Edgar Mitchell, and I think he was an Apollo 8 astronaut. And I love the fact that, he says that actually getting around the other side of the moon and seeing the Earth from this perspective actually does something to you. But I love this bit that you want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck, drag him 250,000 miles out and say, look at that, you son of a bitch. Well, I think we all need to do that at times. Let's take a leaf out of Mitchell's book. But how do we make it practical? Well, this is a picture of the British rowing team from the 2000 Olympics. And for those that, apologize for those that know the story already, but the British rowing team was in a whole heap of mess right through the 80s and 90s. And in their pursuit of gold for the 2000 Olympics, they said, there's a million things that we could spend our money on. There's a million things that we could do to train. But what is our aim? Gold medal. Great. What do we need to do to win that gold medal? Be faster than every other boat in the water. Great. So what is the one question that we're going to use as the filter for every decision we make? And of course, we all know that. Will it make the boat go faster? Super story and super focused. And I used that story when I had an opportunity to work with defense and the Navy in particular in 2015. And we started a transformation program looking at the seaworthiness of the Navy capabilities and how indeed we could put a whole new regulatory framework in place that embraced not only what the Navy was doing, but how it was supported the full life cycle from acquisition, from cradle to grave, essentially, but also how all of the capabilities could come together and work as a whole. Now, in telling that story and the British rowing team story at the beginning of this particular consulting assignment, I left them with the question, and this was the first thing we worked on, was to recognize that, we're in this mess because of a high operational tempo, right? Sort of like trying to get the economy going faster. We've got a whole heap of short-term priorities that always win over long-term sustainability actions. And after 20 years of doing this, where the short-term won over the long-term, a capability collapsed. And there's the systemic risk. So that was where they were coming from. And now in order to go forward, they knew exactly how it all should work together because they'd seen so many times before how it should. But what was the one question they were going to use as the filter to work through their entire scope of new regulatory framework that applies all the way from cradle to grave? And we got to this. And let me get out the way again. It was this. Will this, whatever it is that we're talking about, maximize the operational effect for that mission system within its defined tasking, right? So we're not asking it to do anything other than what it was designed to do, and eliminate or minimize risk to the people involved, the public impacted, and the environment. For therein, was a great question. Every single time, did it maximize operational effect? Yes. Within defined tasking, yes. Well, sometimes these craft are asked, and these people are asked to do things that are beyond what it was designed for doing. But then that, forced the second part. Are we doing it in a way that minimizes risk to people, public, and the environment? And have we got approval to work outside of our defined tasking? So that is a much more responsible way then of examining that. And I am then left wondering, for every organization, what's your one question through which you can filter the decisions that you make so that you project honesty, transparency, mindfulness of the whole and what you're trying to do, collaborate because it's a large organization, probably with a whole tentacles around the world, accountability, are you doing what you said you do? And when it hits the fan, are you showing respect to the people who are telling you they've got a problem, so that you maintain the honesty and transparency? What's your one question that brings those values to life in what you're doing? And if it is just about maximizing profit, then be honest about that. Don't pretend to have planetary concerns. See where your customers go. But it's the doing of this, though, that then codes those decisions into every strand, into the DNA. It's something that's within our fabric to be able to weave the fabric of our organizational matrices. So don't rush past value to get to an outcome. And that pretty much brings us to the end of what I want to say in this webinar. Just a heads up for the next one, because it goes to the issue of how we count value and what leaders count counts. And, we can get back to that thing about energy as well. So just in closing, what I stand for is continuous learning in leadership and governance, and really aiming to find ways to help unify the conversations through the political, the social, and technology aims that we all share. I'm doing some writing and developing masterclasses in systems thinking and leadership. And I love to mentor people who have a planetary perspective or seeking to build their planetary perspective, and help them develop their leadership teams to do that. And this is out today. I'm having worked with 18 other authors to really address the question of what the hell do we do now, given where we are with COVID-19, and that is available on Amazon. And for the next 5 days, the Kindle version of that is just $3.99. So a delight to have you here. If we're not connected, please let's make sure we are. And I thank you for your attendance, and would welcome opening the mics to questions in the 15 minutes that we have available.
Yeah, Richard, it's Alan here. I do have a question around the defining of the one question. And when I work with my own clients around defining their one question, the problem that I have, the step before defining that one question, is being honest with and defining the true purpose of the organization or the agency in the first place, so that they can then benchmark whether they are actually achieving purpose with their one question? How do you ordinarily overcome that definition? Because in my experience, that definition is never from a systemic perspective. It is always from an internal perspective. And that's the challenge, where they're only looking inside as opposed to looking from that outside in.
Well, I deal with the issue, and let me say that landing on that question was not one workshop. You know, it was the result of several, and over time, so that we were doing other elements of the design over a 3-month period. And this was the design of the intervention, right? Not the actual doing of it, but the design of the intervention with the client, and really looking at consequences. Well, of course, in our particular case, the consequences were really quite clear, where they were, you know, well, the chief that sadly lost his job, but he was just, you know, Johnny on the spot at the wrong time when all the holes in the cheese lined up, and that chief of Navy suffered the consequences for being in the chair at the time, when he said to the minister, "Hey, sorry, can't do. We don't have that capability available." And so the consequences for national security in that particular time were patently obvious, and the thing that they most wanted to do was get off the front page of the paper, because they're able to meet their given obligations from government, right? And to build confidence in the minister that they were able to do so without question. So that, from that perspective, was quite simple, because they were, as a servant of government, given their objectives, and the whole national security thread is something that, you know, lives deep within the heart of those that pull on a uniform, because no one pulls on a uniform to make money. So perhaps that was an easier group. In working with corporates, then I ask, so what is the consequences of the action? How wide are you aware, even how widely spread you are? Have you done any vulnerability analysis around that? And get them to look at then what is the experience that they are creating. And not only the experience for people, but for the planet. And this is really where it's really hard to take this conversation away from perhaps next week's conversation, because it goes to the point of, well, is leadership a license to kill? And you go, what? So it's really some very pointed questions. Is leadership a license to kill? You go, no. Well, but hang on. Your company is in the business of making these widgets that require lithium batteries. Have you done any, do you have any care for the 8-year-old kids in, you know, the Congo or Bolivia or elsewhere that are dying mining the ore that delivers the batteries? He says, but we're not in the battery business. I said, well, okay. So that's someone else's problem, is it, that 8-year-old kids are dying? Well, they're in business because you're making things that require lithium batteries. So therefore, you're putting up an artificial boundary that contains your system to just the widget, not the consequences that come from you putting that widget out on the market that does remarkable things for humans, whether or not they are phones like this or what have you. It then forces them to go, well, actually, what could we do? Well, then are you advocating? Are you actually looking at the behaviors that are in place? Where do you source lithium from, etc., and take them back through that says, well, now, if you take a different series of actions, are the consequences of those actions less for the planet and less for the people? And then if we bring those numbers down and make them visible, and this is really getting into the next webinar, then how would you feel about that? Because it's and what would the millennials feel if they knew that's what you were doing? And then you go, okay. So what planetary impact do you want to have? Well, we want to be seen as good citizens. Okay, well, let's have a look at the planetary impact that you're actually having. Let's have a look at the social impact that you're actually having and start counting those things as well as the profit centers that you've created. So it does touch in on that. And it's really the only way to keep that home. Is to be, pull them down through looking at the consequences and ultimately, and I'll be leaning a little on Philip Lawn's work here around a genuine progress indicator in the next session. Sorry, Joe's just made a comment. It looks like Tesla is going to source their lithium in nations that have environmental rules to keep children from mining. Great. And one I like to say here in Australia is BlueScope Steel. Now we all know that steel production takes a huge amount of heat that we cannot yet get through the solar systems and what have you. So they still need to burn some form of fossil fuel to get the heat they need to make steel that's building the built infrastructure and the built environment. What they've said is, but what if we built a solar network to make a contribution back to the grid? Now, I'm not quite sure how far they've gone with that, but that whole notion is the sort of shift that I think corporates can make and then make that shift visible. And you know what? That may attract investor funding. Because it was Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Bank of England, that said that corporations that don't deal with climate change will go bankrupt. And that's another way of that sharp-ended question of saying, well, if you're not going to pay attention to the planet and the people, then what's your time to extinction? When are you going to go bankrupt? I remember poking a guy in the, well, not figuratively poking a guy in there. He was the chief risk officer for a major infrastructure firm here in Melbourne. And I shouldn't perhaps say any more than that, because you may well identify them. But this was going back a dozen or so years following a previous pandemic from SARS that didn't hit Australia that badly. And I said to him, well, what risk do you attend to pandemic planning? He said, mate, I'll worry about pandemic planning only after I've seen meteorites landing in Port Phillip Bay. I go, bloody hell. I wonder if he's still the chief risk officer, whether or not he's worried about pandemic planning and losing a high percentage of his employees in the process. It's remarkable. Any other questions? Sorry, I belted on a bit in response to that. Thank you, Alan. Any more? I can't see any. No? Well, I really look forward then to the next, which will carry out that, or complete that circle of value counted. And as you see, as we begin to explore here in conversation, is that indeed, as Wendy has just noted in the commentary, we need the personal shift before we get the corporate shift. But that can be added, because all we need is the first follower, right? The leader gets the first follower and boom, you know, these things can run and run quickly. And particularly with the millennials who are looking for this sort of response from corporate. And so are investors, right? So value counted. And then I was thinking after that, I would then just do a summary of the awareness ones. Just what have we got in terms of value conceived, value contributed, and value counted, and then where that leads us into the next sessions, which will be on wholeness, and really then getting into the stuff that I've been working with Dr. Joe Bradley on, and viable systems thinking and its application to management, planning, governance, and the like, because that's a way then of organizing to make this real. But that's for the second series, when it shifts from awareness to wholeness. So there we go. Thank you, everyone.